is the tribute you owe me, woman?
I have nothing left to give, my lord.
With this ring, I thee wed.
Hey guys, tonight we will uncover a never-before-told story about the fate of Anne of Cleves, who was crowned Queen of England for only an instant, then vanished into the mists of history. As candlelight flickered in the cold stone chamber of Chelsea Manor, whispers echoed through the court. Could there be a hidden truth behind her brief and awkward marriage to King Henry VIII? Her decline unfolded in silence, gradually fading away without anyone's notice, even though she lived longer than all of Henry's 6 wives. At the age of 41, Anne lay pale and frail, but is lucky really the right word to describe her life, when behind the crown lay years of isolation, illness and betrayal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what the local time is in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne of Cleves, who was crowned Queen of England for only 6 months, lies dying in silence at Chelsea Manor. Candlelight flickers across the cold stone walls as rumours of her critical condition spread rapidly through the court. Unlike the dramatic downfalls of previous queens, Anne's decline has been quiet, gradual, and largely unnoticed. She is the only one to have survived all 6 marriages of Henry VIII. Yet in her sickbed she appears gaunt, pale, and almost forgotten. Behind this outward calm lies years of isolation, suffering from chronic illness, and enduring the ruthless intrigue of royal politics. Anne of Cleves, whose full name is Anne of Cleves, was born on September 22, 1515 in Düsseldorf, the capital of the Duchy of Cleves. She was born into the prestigious ducal family of Cleves and Berg. Her grandfather was Johann II, Duke of Cleves, a staunch traditionalist, and her grandmother was Maria of Jülich-Berg, renowned for her charitable spirit and devout piety. Her father, John III, Duke of Cleves, was a firm supporter of Protestant reform, while her mother, Maria of Jülich-Berg, was gentle and oversaw her children's education with a focus on faith and humility. Anne was the second of 4 children. Her elder sister, Sibylle, later married the Duke of Parma. Then came Anne, followed by Amalia, and finally Wilhelm, the only son in the family. From an early age, Anne was raised in a conservative and discreet environment, in stark contrast to the lavish courts of Europe. She was not taught to dance or to play the lute. Instead, she learned embroidery, traditional cooking, and cultivated virtue through the study of biblical texts. Unlike other princesses who were trained in 2 foreign languages, Anne spoke fluent German and basic French, but she knew neither English nor Latin, a barrier that would prove significant when she arrived in England. Anne's life changed when Thomas Cromwell, chief minister to Henry VIII, sought an alliance with Protestant duchies against the Catholic powers of Europe. In 1539, Anne's background and reputation made her an ideal candidate. The young painter Hans Holbein was sent to Cleves to capture her likeness. The resulting portrait showed a graceful beauty with luminous skin and a serene gaze that captivated King Henry. Yet reality proved very different. Anne arrived in England at the end of 1539, bearing her natural simplicity and awkwardness before the elaborate royal ceremonies. On January 6, 1540 at Greenwich Palace, Anne and Henry were joyfully Wednesday. Their wedding night, however, marked the beginning of tragedy, as Henry claimed he could not legitimize the marriage due to disappointment in her appearance and an inability to overcome his reluctance. The marriage lasted exactly 6 months before being annulled on grounds of non-consummation and a prior engagement. In that brief time, Anne neither conceived nor bore any children. Their union produced no offspring. Despite the annulment, Anne was granted the title King's Beloved Sister, an annual allowance of £3,000, and several estates including Richmond Palace and Hea Castle. Yet these favours could not fill the void in her heart, which longed for family and warmth. She had no relatives at the English court, only a handful of loyal servants, and the occasional banquet at which the king displayed his mercy. Now, as Anne lies dying in the Chelsea Manor chamber, all of that seems like a distant memory. 6 months of glory as queen, Holbein's famous portrait, the pomp of courtly gatherings, and the cruel gossip of the populace. She, once deemed the luckiest for escaping the executioner's axe, now endures utter loneliness and the memory of a life dictated by royal politics. All of this composes the tragic portrait of Anne of Cleves, a figure at once silent and resolute, whose brief but perilous journey unfolded between the sword and the throne. The wedding bells tolled softly through the halls of Greenwich Palace, their clear tones drifting like distant lullabies. Yet behind the jubilant music lay an undercurrent of tragedy. On that first night they were to be husband and wife. King Henry VIII discovered he could not legitimate the marriage. He blamed Anne's appearance and insisted she lacked the appropriate knowledge of intimacy. Though Anne was willing and unashamed, Henry's own reluctance proved insurmountable. In the hush of that cold chamber, the bond they had just formed shattered like fragile glass. 6 months passed in a haze of courtly intrigue, and before the year was out, their union was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation and a pre-existing betrothal. In an instant, Anne's brief reign as queen dissolved into paperwork and proclamations. She accepted the annulment without protest, fully aware that resistance could cost her everything, even her life. In exchange for her silence and submission, she received a generous settlement. Vast estates, including Richmond Palace and He Castle, once the residence of Anne Boleyn, and an annual allowance of £3,000. She was granted the lofty title King's Beloved Sister, a designation many viewed as victory enough. After all, she had escaped the axe, retained her fortune, and gained a position unlike any other former queen. Yet this supposed triumph proved to be a gilded cage. Anne found herself a foreign woman, stranded in a court that regarded her with polite curiosity rather than genuine affection. Stripped of her German entourage, she watched as Catherine Howard, a vivacious teenager, ascended to the throne she had barely occupied. Court life went on without her. Grand balls, elaborate masks, whispered intrigues, and the constant murmur of politics from which she was now excluded. Her sole purpose, it seemed, was to stand as evidence of Henry's magnanimity, appearing at select ceremonies to remind the realm that he spared her life out of mercy. The relationship between Anne and Henry settled into courteous formalities. From time to time she received invitations to dine at court, bearing gifts for the royal family to demonstrate her goodwill. She maintained a cordial friendship with Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, sharing gentle conversations in Mary's private chambers, where they spoke of faith and family, laughter and regret. Yet for all her measured kindness, Anne was never permitted to return to Cleves, nor was she ever considered for remarriage. Her days became an endless march of ritual and isolation, present in name, but never at the centre. When Henry died and Edward VI ascended the throne, Anne expected at least a measure of change under a Protestant king. Instead, the young monarch's advisers viewed her merely as a relic of a failed alliance. She faded further into the background, her allowance maintained but her influence non-existent. The very faith that had once made her desirable to Henry, her Protestant upbringing, now marked her as irrelevant in Edward's reformist court. She no longer dined with the council, nor did she preside over any charitable endeavours of state. She lived almost entirely within the confines of her estates, a royal pensioner, rather than a participant in governance. The accession of Mary I brought yet another shift. Mary's fierce Catholic convictions sparked hope that Anne might find favour through shared empathy. After all, Anne had shown Mary respect during her years of displacement. But Mary's advisers, determined to reinforce Catholic orthodoxy, again relegated Anne to the periphery. Her earlier Protestant leanings remained a stigma, and her attempts to demonstrate loyalty were met with cool restraint. Invitations to court were infrequent, and any lingering hopes of regaining prominence were gently but firmly dashed. In the solitude that followed, Anne's health began to wane. A persistent cough took hold of her, day bleeding into night as she struggled to draw breath. She lost weight, her once dignified figure growing frail and gaunt. Pain gripped her chest with an unrelenting cruelty. Some guessed it was tuberculosis, others feared cancer. In an age when medicine relied on leeches, herbal concoctions and prayers, relief was fleeting and incomplete. Anne retreated to Chelsea Manor, the same estate that had once offered refuge to Catherine Parr, and there she awaited the end of her long, starless exile. At Chelsea, Anne remained surrounded by a handful of loyal servants who tended to her every need. She spent her days in quiet reflection, praying by candlelight and reading the scriptures in a voice grown weak from disuse. When she ventured into the garden, it was only to feel a breeze on her cheeks and to watch the roses bloom, their colour a reminder of the beauty and volatility of life. Yet even these small comforts could not stave off the inexorable advance of illness. On July 16th, 1557, Anne of Cleves drew her final breath at the age of 41. Her passing was as unobtrusive as her decline. No grand funeral cortege, no weeks of courtly mourning. Instead, she was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey with a modest service, attended by those few who still held affection for her. Her tomb, a simple stone slab in a side chapel, bore no effigy or elaborate inscription, only the barest acknowledgement of a woman who once bore the title of queen. Thus ended the life of Anne of Cleves, not with fanfare, but with a hush that spoke volumes. Her story, woven through 6 months of splendour and decades of obscurity, stands as a testament to a quiet endurance. She survived where others perished, navigating the treacherous currents of Tudor politics with a dignity that outlasted the cruelest of storms. In the fragile legacy she left behind, we find not the roar of empire, but the gentle persistence of a woman determined to live, even when the world had forgotten her name. In her final years, Anne of Cleves retreated into near-total seclusion at Chelsea Manor, once the residence of Catherine Parr. There, she maintained a quiet resilience, never complaining despite the ravages of illness that racked her body. She bore her suffering with the same composed dignity that had characterized her brief tenure as queen. When at last her life ebbed away, she had almost no family at her side, no children to comfort her, no grand funeral procession befitting her former status. Instead, her passing was simple and unadorned, a gentle close to the chapter of a one-time Queen of England. Although she was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, a rare honour for anyone who had reigned for only 6 months, her tomb occupies a modest niche away from the glittering royal vaults. There is no elaborate sculpted effigy, no ornate carvings to draw a visitor's gaze. Instead, a solitary stone slab marks her resting place, easily overlooked among the grand memorials of monarchs and courtiers. This unassuming sepulchre reflects the paradox of Anne's life. She was treated with official reverence, yet her memory was quietly consigned to the shadows. Anne's death was not a spectacle of grief or horror, but rather a gradual erasure from the world she had briefly inhabited. She slipped from public view just as quietly as she had entered it. Over the years, she had lived under the ghostly echoes of her failed marriage, haunted by Henry's cruel barbs about her appearance and alleged ignorance of intimacy. Those rumours, once spread to justify the annulment, cast a long, dark shadow over her reputation. What began as a personal failing in the king's eyes became political ammunition to deflect blame and protect his image. Anne carried the weight of these unjust whispers in silence, her spirit undiminished even as her flesh grew frail. Despite the slander, Anne chose not to retaliate. She preserved her composure and continued to fulfill her self-appointed role as King's beloved sister. She sent wedding gifts to Catherine Howard and graciously hosted gatherings at He Castle when summoned. She attended royal ceremonies with unfailing courtesy, offering a steady grace amid the turbulence of Tudor politics. Modern historians often interpret this conduct as their own form of intelligence. Anne knew when to step back, when to yield, and when to maintain a loyal front, all to ensure her survival in a court where dissent could be deadly. Thus she moved through the reigns of 3 successive monarchs, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, like a quiet stranger who appeared when needed and then faded away. Under Edward VI, the young king whose rule leaned firmly toward Protestant reform, Anne's existence was virtually invisible. She did not sit on councils, nor did she influence policy. She simply existed as a pensioner of the crown. When Mary I ascended, her Catholic zeal rendered Anne's Protestant heritage unwelcome. Once more, Anne found herself barred from influence, relegated to the margins of a court that viewed her faith with suspicion. By the early 1550s, Anne's health had become precarious. She suffered from persistent chest pains that modern scholars surmise could have been tuberculosis or lung cancer ailments, for which Tudor medicine offered no cure. Herbal poultices, leechings, and prayers were the best remedies available, yet none could stave off the relentless decay. She spoke little of her suffering, though in occasional letters she hinted at the fatigue and cough that haunted her days. These glimpses into her condition reveal a woman enduring unimaginable pain with fortitude rather than complaint. In the twilight of her existence, Anne's world contracted to the few rooms she occupied and the handful of devoted servants who cared for her. She spent hours in prayer, seeking solace in the quiet hymns and passages of scripture she had known since childhood. When her strength permitted, she would stroll through the manor's private gardens, inhaling the fragrance of roses and herbs, as though drawing in a final measure of earthly beauty. Often, she paused by a sundial, watching the slow procession of shadows, perhaps reflecting on the ephemeral nature of power and life itself. Although she was no longer a queen in title beyond ceremonial registers, Anne retained the honorary garments and jewels granted to her in the settlement. Yet these trappings of royalty felt hollow in the face of illness and isolation. She no longer donned them for public display. Instead, she kept them locked away, symbols of a past that had lost its luster. Her only tangible link to her royal identity was the annual allowance that sustained her, and even that could have been revoked had she displeased the monarchs who succeeded Henry. Elizabeth I's succession did little to change Anne's circumstances. While Elizabeth's court valued youth and wit, Anne was seen as a relic of a diplomacy that had failed. She was permitted to remain in England, unlike some foreign princesses, who were sometimes returned home or seldom allowed to stay, yet she was given no further duties. She was neither advisor nor emissary. She was simply an elderly lady of royal rank, her voice unheard in the proceedings that shaped the kingdom. When at last Anne's final breath came, it was not accompanied by public mourning or royal decree. There were no banners flying at half-mast, no ringing of great bells across London. Instead, her passing was marked by the hushed footsteps of those few who tended her bedside, the flicker of candles in a quiet chamber. News of her death drifted through the court like a soft sigh, and then, gradually, the world carried on as before. Anne of Cleves' life and death challenge us to reconsider our notions of strength and legacy. She did not seize power through spectacle or protest, nor did she command armies or author treaties. Instead, she wielded endurance as her weapon, preserving her life and dignity in the face of slander, illness, and displacement. Her burial in a modest chapel at Westminster Abbey stands as a testament to a life marked by quiet perseverance rather than triumphant acclaim. In the centuries that followed, Anne's story was often reduced to a footnote, a mere anecdote about an unconsummated marriage. Yet recent scholarship has sought to illuminate the resilience beneath the rumours. Artists and writers have revisited her tale, portraying her not as a mere casualty of Tudor whim, but as a woman of principle who navigated the perils of her time with grace. They emphasise how, in a court where a single glance of disfavour could doom a woman, Anne's choice to yield rather than rebel may have been the most courageous act of all. Thus, as we reflect on her years at Chelsea Manor, let us remember that Anne of Cleves' greatest achievement was survival. In a world that prized noise and spectacle, she found power in silence. In the ever-turning wheel of Tudor dynasties, she held her place not by sword or crown, but by quiet, steadfast resolve. And in that resolve, she transcended the fate that befell so many others living long enough to see kings rise and fall, and leaving behind a legacy not of glory, but of grace. In her final days, Anne of Cleves retired to a quiet corner of Chelsea Manor, accompanied only by a handful of loyal servants who had tended her through thick and thin. Each morning, she would rise with the dawn's pale light, whispering a brief prayer of thanks before partaking in a simple meal of porridge or bread with cheese. When her strength allowed, she ventured into the small walled garden, moving slowly among the roses and herbs, pausing to breathe in the soft fragrance of thyme and lavender. The gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds provided a rare comfort in her hours of solitude. Anne's will, completed in June 1557, offers a tender glimpse into her final thoughts and affections. She made modest provisions for those who had remained by her side. A small sum for the servant who had served her longest, a heartfelt acknowledgement of fidelity rather than a grand spectacle of wealth. Her bequests extended to the poor of Lewisham, Sodgewich and Lambeth, where she left tokens of charity, loaves of bread, coins to ease hardship, and simple clothing. These gestures, though humble, spoke volumes of her enduring generosity even in the shadow of death. When Anne at last closed her eyes in eternal rest, she left behind a legacy that was quietly significant. She had secured an annual pension of £3,000, a sum considerable for its time yet entirely at the monarch's discretion, and subject to revocation. She retained several estates, Richmond Palace and He Castle. Among them, though, these grand structures stood removed from the bustle of court, silent reminders of her ephemeral link to power. Her title, King's beloved sister, remained purely honorific, a courtesy rather than a source of real influence. Through her life and death, Anne demonstrated that attachment to the throne was fragile and easily undone. Anne's tomb lies in the south ambulatory of Westminster Abbey, a secluded corridor rather than the lofty royal chapel. There is no imposing statue, no carved architrave to convey majesty, only a plain stone slab, marked with her name and the dates of her birth and death. Visitors passing by often do so without recognition, their footsteps echoing over a resting place that once belonged to a queen. This final resting spot, so unassuming, so easily overlooked, embodies the arc of her life. A brief moment of splendor, then a gentle fade into obscurity. Today, historians are beginning to reassess Anne of Cleves, not as merely the luckiest of Henry VIII's wives, but as a symbol of silent resilience. She never rallied armies, never penned defiance, nor uttered complaints against her fate. Instead, she exercised a quiet intelligence, choosing her moments of compliance and discretion to preserve her life. In a court where a single misstep could lead to execution, her decision to accept her annulment and adapt to life as a royal pensioner may have been her most courageous act. Anne's story challenges traditional notions of power. We often imagine strength as something loud and triumphant, battles fought, speeches made, crowns seized. Yet her path suggests another kind of might, the ability to endure suffering, to practice restraint, and to live on despite having been cast aside. The horrific aspect of her death was not the violence of an executioner's blade, but the loneliness that enveloped her, and the merciless forgetfulness of history. It was a slow, systematic vanishing, far more chilling for its quietude than any public spectacle. In that small garden at Chelsea Manor, Anne's footsteps in the grass were among the last reminders of her presence. The petals she brushed with her fingertips, the prayers she whispered in the hush of evening, these intimate gestures formed the true testament of her spirit. She did not perish in flames or beneath the axe. She slipped away in the soft gloom of her final chamber. It was a departure so gentle that the world barely noticed. Yet it closed the final chapter on a life that had begun under the grand expectations of diplomacy and ended in humble self-reliance. Her humble tomb in Westminster Abbey now stands as a quiet monument to endurance. It invites reflection on the unseen battles each person fights and the dignity that lies in simply surviving when so many forces conspire to erase one's story. Anne of Cleves' journey was marked by a fleeting crown and lasting solitude, by alliances forged and swiftly broken, by harsh judgments that were never her doing. In the silent corridors of history, her memory endures not as a footnote of convenience, but as a lesson in the power of patience, the strength of acceptance, and the grace of quiet survival. Anne of Cleves outlived Henry VIII by a full decade, quietly bearing witness to the rise and fall of 5 other wives. 2 were beheaded, 1 died in childbirth, 1 was deposed, and 1 became a widow. Their stories captured the court's attention with dramatic peaks of tragedy and spectacle, while Anne remained on the periphery. She lived silently, steering clear of the dangerous games of power that defined the Tudor court. Her extended survival stands as testament to a subtle intelligence. She recognized early on that opposing Henry could cost her life. Rather than allow pride to dictate her actions, she chose obedience, accepting the annulment of her marriage and securing her safety, along with a considerable settlement. This decision required no small measure of courage. In a brutal court where dissent often meant death, compliance was the wisest path to preservation. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, Anne was still alive, an elderly noblewoman, with no official title or power, merely an annuitant living off her yearly pension of £3,000. Her estates stretched across the countryside, yet they brought little solace, for she remained tied to England by royal decree, and could not return to Cleves without explicit permission. Language barriers and cultural differences made integration into Elizabeth's court all but impossible. She dwelt on memories of home through the occasional letters of her brother in Germany, their words a fragile lifeline back to her origins. Among the few bonds she maintained, the friendships with Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth were most dear. Both princesses had grown up in her presence and remembered her kindness. Mary, in particular, had spoken of Anne's gentle encouragement during the turbulent years when Mary's own claim to the throne was under threat. But Mary's accession as queen cooled their relationship. Religious differences, deep and bitter, stood between them. Under Elizabeth I, Anne found herself yet again regarded as a relic of a bygone political project, a diplomatic gamble that had failed. Neither princess turned queen could, or perhaps would, restore her to the prominence she once held, and Anne faded further from the centre stage. Meanwhile, her health steadily deteriorated. Tudor records refer to a pain in the side and a relentless dry cough symptoms that suggest tuberculosis or another chronic pulmonary illness. 16th century medicine offered little more than bloodletting, herbal poultices and prayers, none of which provided real relief. Anne withdrew into a small suite at Chelsea Manor, relying on a handful of devoted servants who administered rudimentary treatments and read her letters from home. These loyal attendants bore witness to her waning strength, offering what comfort they could through gentle ministrations and quiet companionship. As the months passed, Anne's world contracted to the twilit corridors of her manor and the faint glow of candlelight in her chamber. She spent hours tucked away in an armchair by the window, gazing out at the gardens where she once walked freely, now too frail even to tend a single rose. Her mind wandered to her youth in Cleves, the laughter of her sisters, the glow of family gatherings, the warmth of her father's affectionate gaze. These recollections brought both comfort and sorrow, for she knew she would never again feel the embrace of her homeland. On July 16th, 1557, Anne of Cleves drew her last breath at Chelsea Manor. Her passing was marked by no royal decree, no state funeral. There were no trumpets, no gathering of nobles in black attire. Instead, those faithful few who remained at her side observed a modest service at Westminster Abbey. Anne was buried, not in the grand royal chapel, but in a simple aisle off the south ambulatory. A plain stone slab bore her name and the dates of her life. No ornate epitaph, no carved effigy of regal finery. That unassuming ceremony encapsulated the essence of her existence. A life marked by a brief burst of power, followed by decades of quiet endurance. Anne's final resting place sits amid the echoes of kings and queens, yet she blends into the shadows, a silent witness to the tumult of Tudor England. Her modest grave in Westminster Abbey stands as the ultimate testament to her resilience. She lived, unbowed by scandal and unbroken by betrayal, choosing survival over spectacle. Anne of Cleves' story challenges our conventional understanding of strength. We often admire those who fight and shout, who seize the day with grand gestures. Yet her true victory lay in the art of endurance, knowing when to yield, when to remain silent, and how to navigate a court where a single misstep could spell disaster. Her horrific fate was not a violent death worthy of dramatic chronicles, but rather the slow erosion of relevance and the crushing weight of loneliness. It was a horror born of invisibility, a cruelty that stems from being forgotten in life and in death. As visitors wander the echoing vaults of Westminster Abbey, their footsteps barely touching her unadorned tomb, Anne's legacy whispers to those who listen. Power can be fleeting, but dignity can endure. She did not claim glory by sword or by speech. She claimed it through quiet survival. In a world where women were often reduced to their marriages or dismissed after a failed alliance, Anne of Cleves remained resolutely present, steadfast in her resolve to live on her own terms. Her journey from a distant German duchess to the fleeting heights of English queenship, and finally to a patient resignation in Chelsea Manor, offers a profound lesson. True courage may not roar. Sometimes it speaks in the softest voices, in the smallest acts of kindness, in the decision to preserve one's life rather than stake it on pride. Anne of Cleves' life and death, framed by the flicker of candlelight and the hush of deserted corridors, remind us that survival itself can be a triumphant act, one that endures long after the pageantry fades into memory. When Anne of Cleves first set foot on English soil in December 1539, she was struck by the stark contrast between the court she had known and the one that now surrounded her. In Cleves, women were prized for their virtue, humility, and piety. Their days were filled with prayer, modest dress, and quiet contemplation. Yet, at the Tudor court, the expectations had little to do with inner grace. A queen was meant to be a beacon of beauty, a skilled musician, a fluent speaker, and a master of courtly wit. Anne knew none of these arts. She could neither dance in the intricate patterns of a mask nor coax melody from a lute. Her grasp of English was minimal, limited to a few phrases rehearsed for form's sake, and her accent sounded to English ears like the tolling of a foreign bell. Court ladies murmured behind fan and veil at her stiff gowns and her halting speech, and in the hush of alcoves she sometimes caught glances tinged with amusement. Yet Anne did not allow the weight of mockery to crush her spirit. Each morning she rose before dawn, offered a brief prayer for strength, and donned a gown of sober hue. She greeted every courtier she met with a soft curtsy and a gentle smile, refusing to lash out or plead for sympathy. When King Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, that bright and vivacious teenager who would become his fifth wife, Anne sent a carefully chosen gift, a delicate silk handkerchief, embroidered with her own initials. She enclosed a note of heartfelt congratulations, an acknowledgement of courtly duty more than personal desire. To some this seemed a simple courtesy. To others it was a shrewd gesture of self-preservation. By showing respect to the new queen, Anne maintained her own dignity and avoided the perilous whirl of court gossip. Beneath this calm exterior, however, lay a profound loneliness. Anne's German attendants, women who had shared her meals and secrets since her arrival, were dismissed, sent back across the sea to their homeland. Her connections to the Cleves court, once her anchor in a world of shifting alliances, were severed. In England, she had no family, no childhood friends, and no devoted ladies in waiting to guide her through the labyrinthine etiquette of Tudor splendour. At banquets and dances, she remained a polite observer, her voice barely rising above the soft rustle of silk. She watched as alliances formed and dissolved around her, as laughter and music swirled in candlelit chambers. Yet she had no part in the intricate dance of influence that defined life at court. Gradually, Anne became known as the Ghost Queen, a presence felt more in legend than in person. Official documents still bore her name and title, and her London residence at Richmond Palace stood as a reminder of royal favour. Yet the palace was a cold, empty shell when she was away, its halls echoing with memories of a queen who rarely ventured there. She was welcome at state ceremonies, but she wielded no real sway over policy or patronage. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they found her courteous but silent, her eyes polite behind an impassive mask. The English court regarded her as a curiosity, a foreign princess who had failed to capture the king's heart, and thus served as proof of his generosity in sparing her head. Anne was not permitted to return to Cleves unless explicitly summoned by the crown. She spent years caught in this unspoken prison, a foreigner comfortable only in her own household, but barred from returning home. To communicate, she relied on interpreters who stood at a respectful distance, rendering her words into English and translating complaints and requests back into German. This barrier of language magnified her isolation, for each conversation felt formal and incomplete. There were no spontaneous confidences shared over afternoon tea, no whispered prayers exchanged before bedtime. Her world narrowed to the faces of her servants and the dull portraits that hung on palace walls, painted by artists who had never truly seen her. In the quiet moments between audiences and ceremonies, Anne often retreated to her private chambers, where she kept a small book of psalms in German. She traced the calligraphy with slender fingers, finding solace in familiar verses that spoke of refuge and mercy. Occasionally, she would close her eyes and imagine the gentle hills of Cleves, the soft murmur of the Rhine, the laughter of her sisters echoing through candlelit corridors. These daydreams flickered like fading stars against the harsh brightness of Tudor opulence. Despite her inward retreat, Anne never refused a summons from the court. If asked to attend a masque, she would appear in a gown of muted colour, her posture gracious, her face serene. At feasts, she accepted the cup of wine with a silent nod. She sent gifts for royal christenings and condolences for sudden deaths, maintaining the ceremonial duties expected of her rank. This steadfast compliance baffled some observers, but endeared her to others, who marvelled at her unbroken composure in a place where few remained unscathed by the relentless currents of favour and disfavour. Over time, the initial astonishment at Anne's unfamiliar ways softened into a kind of acceptance. The courtiers no longer whispered as much. They simply treated her as part of the court's background tapestry. She became an enduring fixture, as constant as the walls of the palace, yet as untouchable as a distant constellation. Visitors would ask after the Flanders mare, but few expected more than a courteous bow. Anne's singular act of survival lay in this transformation. By refusing to protest or to rail against her fate, she slipped beneath the waves of controversy and emerged on the far shore, unbroken and still breathing. In this hushed existence, Anne of Cleves found an unexpected freedom. Free from the daily scheming that consumed the court, she could direct her energies towards small acts of kindness, sending alms to the poor, commissioning prayers for the sick, and maintaining the gardens of her estates. She sowed herbs and flowers that reminded her of home, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, and daisies for innocence. These simple pleasures anchored her in the present and softened the ache of exile. Thus, Anne of Cleves navigated the treacherous seas of Tudor England with a quiet resolve. She arrived as a foreign princess, unprepared for the glare of royal expectation. Yet she endured by mastering the art of stillness, remaining present without intrusion, fulfilling her duties without claim to power, and preserving her dignity when everything else was at stake. She was a ghost in a grand theatre of ambition, but her silent persistence became her triumph. In the end, Anne's story is not one of dramatic revolt or desperate pleading, but of a gentle fortitude that weathered the storms of court life. By embracing patience and restraint, she crafted a life of modest stability out of the fragments of a thwarted marriage. Her legacy invites us to see strength in silence and dignity in quiet endurance, reminding us that sometimes the surest way to survive is to remain unshaken amidst the tides of change. Under Edward VI's reign, from 1547 to 1553, Anne of Cleves found herself increasingly marginalized. The court, firmly in the hands of reformers, viewed her as nothing more than the remnants of a failed diplomatic venture, an inconvenient reminder of Thomas Cromwell's miscalculation. Her title of King's beloved sister remained on parchment, but in practice it meant little. She was seldom invited to council meetings or lavish court festivals, and her presence at state ceremonies felt more like a formality than a position of influence. The ministers of Edward's government, zealous in their Protestant reforms, had no use for the quiet German princess who had once been selected to cement foreign alliances. They busied themselves with changing prayer books and dissolving chantries, hardly pausing to consider the feelings or status of a former queen whose only crime had been to survive. When Mary I ascended the throne in 1553, Anne dared to hope for a revival of her courtly fortunes. Mary, a devout Catholic, might have looked kindly on a woman who had never resisted the rightful Tudor succession. Indeed, in the earliest days of Mary's rule, there were gentle overtures, invitations to private masses, and respectful inquiries into Anne's well-being. Yet the momentum of religious policy overrode personal sentiment. Mary's advisers, staunch supporters of Catholic restoration, viewed Anne's Protestant roots with suspicion. Rumours whispered that Anne's quiet piety was laced with Lutheran sympathies. Though Mary continued to address her as sister in public, the warmth of that term was hollowed out by an undercurrent of distrust. Thus, Anne's one true friendship at court. Her bond with Princess Mary before her accession was chilled by the demands of religious conformity. In private, Mary remembered Anne's kindness during the years of her own confinement, but in public, Mary could not risk the appearance of tolerating Protestant influence near her person, and so Anne's place at Mary's table grew ever more remote. She ceased receiving invitations to grand banquets and official celebrations, and even the occasional gifts she had once been granted were scaled back. It was a polite exile. She remained in England, but her presence was no longer deemed necessary for the Catholic restoration. As Anne aged, her body began to betray her. Tudor records note a persistent fatigue that seemed to sap her strength by midday, a relentless dry cough that rattled her chest, and a pain in the side that radiated through her ribs. These symptoms spoke of a chronic pulmonary ailment many suspected tuberculosis, while others feared a malignancy of the lung. In a medical landscape still reliant on bloodletting, mustard plasters, and herbal concoctions, there was little comfort to be found. Physicians applied leeches to her temples and administered bitter waters made from hound's tongue and hemlock. Apothecaries pressed poultices of comfrey and marshmallow root to her chest, hoping to relieve her cough. Clerics offered prayers and indulgences, imploring divine intervention. Yet none of these measures arrested the steady decline of her health. In the face of these afflictions, Anne withdrew fully to Chelsea Manor. Here, removed from the pomp of court life, She was cared for by a handful of faithful servants who had stood by her since the annulment of her marriage. They brought her beds of fresh linen, warmed her broth by the hearth, and knelt beside her as she prayed in the soft candlelight. The manor, once filled with music and chatter during her more public days, was now hushed, broken only by the gentle rustle of pages as Anne turned them in her cherished German prayer book. Despite her physical fragility, Anne continued to receive an annual pension of £3,000, a generous amount, yet entirely contingent on the goodwill of the reigning monarch. She held rights to several estates: Richmond Palace, He Castle, and Bletchingley, each a sprawling testament to the wealth she had secured. Yet Anne understood too well that these privileges were Henry's gift, not her birthright, and could vanish as swiftly as they had been granted. Whenever a new monarch was crowned, she braced herself for inquiries into her loyalty. She sent courteous letters of fealty, affirming her obedience and her prayers for the realm's prosperity. She refrained from any act that might be construed as political ambition, avoiding large patronage projects or public displays of influence. Anne's seclusion at Chelsea became a prudent strategy. By keeping her circle small and her petitions minimal, she minimized the risk of offending powerful ministers. She never ventured to press for favors or titles, knowing that any request might be seen as overstepping. Instead, she lived on the gentle assurances of her pension, using a modest portion to maintain her household and the remainder to support the poor in nearby villages. She sent coins to the destitute of Lewisham and Lambeth, ensuring that her small acts of charity left a quiet but meaningful impact. On occasion, a knight or a courtier would arrive with a request for a loan or a plea for an endorsement, hoping that the widow of Henry VIII might still hold a measure of sway. Anne declined politely, explaining that her resources were allocated to her fixed expenses and the care of her faithful servants. She referred them to the court's official channels, where power truly resided. In doing so, she avoided entangling herself in the shifting alliances of Friedewald or Cecil, remaining a neutral presence who neither courted favour nor incited hostility. As political tensions rose and fell, pragmatic sanctions, alliances with France, rebellions in the North, Anne observed from her quiet corner. She read accounts of foreign affairs in the few broadsheets that found their way to Chelsea, her eyes tracing each line with keen interest. Never did she write to advise, nor did she send commentary on state matters. Her role was purely that of a witness, her mind absorbing the world's tumult without offering judgment. In her muted way, she bore the memory of each upheaval, storing them like pages in a private chronicle. Thus, Anne of Cleves lived out her final years, once a queen at the heart of Tudor diplomacy, now a long-lived widow, moving at a whisper's pace. She remained in England until her dying day, an exile clothed in velvet and lace, sustained by a pension she dared never challenge. Though her body weakened, her resolve stayed strong. She refused to complain or to demand more than what she had earned through years of patient endurance. Her story under Edward VI and Mary I is a study in quiet adaptation. While others wielded swords or words, Anne wielded discretion. She recognized that the court's true power lay in proximity to rulership, and she chose to exist at its edge, safe from the storms that raged at its center. In doing so, she preserved her life and her dignity, living long enough to see the Tudor saga unfold through yet another generation. Her name a silent footnote in the chronicles of kings, but her presence a living testament to the strength of silent survival. In the years leading up to her death, Anne of Cleves embraced a daily rhythm of quiet rituals that grounded her spirits amid sweeping memories of courtly life. Each morning, she rose with the faint light of dawn, her breath visible in the cool air of Chelsea Old Manor. She knelt beside her simple oak prayer bench and whispered devotions in German, reciting psalms that her mother had taught her in childhood. The rising sun filtered through narrow windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced above her bowed head. When she rose, she tucked her prayer book away and moved to a low stool by the hearth, where she spent hours deftly weaving linen scraps into knitted garments. Her fingers, though weakened by age and illness, continued the steady motions she had practiced since youth. Afternoons found Anne in the modest walled garden behind the manor. There she tended a collection of herbs and flowers, lavender for calm, rosemary for remembrance, and marigolds for protection. She knelt among the beds, pressing hands stained with earth to her cheeks as she inhaled the quiet scent of time. Occasionally, a small gathering of local gentlewomen would arrive, cousins of her former ladies-in-waiting or neighbours from nearby estates. Anne would greet them with a soft nod, offering tea brewed from chamomile picked from the garden. The conversations were sparse, punctuated by the rustle of skirts and polite inquiries about health. These visits were brief reprieves from the silence, moments when the steady tick of court time receded and was replaced by the gentle rhythms of country life. Throughout these solitary days, letters arrived from her brother in Cleves. His handwriting curled across thin sheets of parchment, telling of harvests in the Rhineland vineyards, of his own children's laughter, and of his enduring wish for Anne's peace. She read his missives by candlelight in the evenings, marking each line with a trembling fingertip. The letters were her bridge to a homeland she had not seen in nearly 2 decades. Though her responses were few written in halting English or French, she signed each note, "Your obedient sister," a humble echo of the title once bestowed upon her by the King of England. In June 1557, with her health failing and her spirit prepared for what was to come, Anne dictated her final will. She summoned her steward and read aloud the carefully drafted document, her voice soft but clear. She bequeathed small sums of money and trinkets to the servants who had remained by her side, the chambermaiden who had smoothed her gowns at dawn, the cook who had prepared her simple broth, and the gardener who had tended her roses. She ensured that each of these faithful souls received a token of gratitude, however modest, rather than grand estates. Her instructions extended to the poor of Lewisham, Soudley, and Lambeth. She left provisions for food and clothing, enough to ease the hardship of winter months for those villages on the outskirts of London. There were no large gifts for dukes, earls, or courtiers, only heartfelt remembrances for those who served her quietly in her retreats from the spotlight. On the 16th of July, 1557, Anne of Cleves breathed her last at Chelsea Manor, her chamber lit by a single smouldering candle. She was 41 years old. In those final moments, her breath came slow and measured, each inhalation a prayer, each exhalation a release. Only her most devoted attendants remained at her bedside, holding her hands and murmuring comforting words in German. There were no trumpets, no tolling of great bells. Her passing was marked by the soft rustle of silken skirts and the muted sob of a single linen kerchief. Her body was prepared with the same quiet dignity that had marked her life. The attendants washed her skin and laid her in a simple shroud of white linen. They arranged her hands over her chest, where a small rosary she once wore lay threaded between her fingers. The finery of her youth, velvet gowns, jewelled collars, remained locked away in cedar chests, symbols of a past too vivid for her final rest. Anne's funeral procession was a gentle affair. Instead of a grand cortege, her hearse was drawn by 2 sombre bays along narrow streets lined with hushed onlookers. No state officials flanked her bier. Only a handful of close servants and a lone cleric accompanied her to Westminster Abbey. Inside the venerable walls of the abbey, the service was held not in the royal chapel but in a nearby aisle, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows across stone columns. There was no royal decree demanding a week of mourning, no courtly black banners hanging from palace windows. Instead, there was a simple coffin lowered into a modest tomb, a niche in the south ambulatory, far from the vaulted chamber where kings and queens lay in splendour. The inscription was minimal. Anne of Cleves, Queen of England for 6 months. There was no ornate effigy to capture her likeness, no heraldic shields to boast her status. Just a solitary stone slab offering testament to a life that had touched the pinnacles of power and then retreated into serene obscurity. In the hush that followed, as visitors filed past and barely noticed the unadorned tomb, Anne's story lingered in the quiet corners of the abbey. No trumpets heralded her death. No chroniclers penned epic verses. Her legacy was woven instead into the small acts of kindness recorded in parish registers, gifts of bread to the poor, tokens of comfort to ailing servants. Her name echoed softly in the whispered prayers of those who remembered her gentleness. Thus ended the earthly chapter of Anne of Cleves, whose life had unfolded like a dimly burning candle, bright for a fleeting moment at the heart of Tudor opulence, then flickering in the gentle embrace of twilight. In that final stillness, she embodied the quiet strength of endurance, choosing to live fully in the margins rather than perish in the maelstrom of ambition. Her funeral simplicity spoke volumes. Her true power lay not in crowns or alliances, but in the grace with which she faced each dawn, each prayer, and each farewell. Anne's tomb lies in the south ambulatory of Westminster Abbey, a modest corridor seldom visited by the throngs drawn to the grand royal chapels. There stands a simple slab of pale stone, unadorned by carved figures or heraldic shields, just a name, a date, and the barest acknowledgement of her former station. Passers-by might glance down as they hurry past toward the more famous resting places, but few pause to consider the quiet dignity lying just beneath their feet. It is fitting, in a melancholy way, that Anne of Cleves' final resting place should fade into the architecture of the abbey, much as her life faded from the tumult of Tudor drama. The starkness of that unembellished tomb reflects her own journey, a moment of brightness within royal splendor, followed by a long, whispering exit into obscurity. In recent years, historians have taken a keener interest in Anne's life, re-examining her story through the lens of human resilience rather than political failure. Gone is the simplistic notion of her as merely the lucky wife who escaped the executioner's axe. Instead, scholars praise her as an exemplar of silent strength, someone who refused to engage in bitter disputes or public recriminations, and chose, instead, to navigate a brutal court with prudence and grace. Documentaries now feature soft-spoken narrators, recounting how Anne survived in an environment where a single misstep could mean disgrace or death. Biographers describe her calm acceptance of hardship, her steadfast charity, and her refusal to allow humiliation to break her spirit. Academic works highlight how Anne's refusal to lash out or embroil herself in factional strife was a calculated strategy for survival. They point to her unwavering courtesy to Catherine Howard, even after Catherine's dramatic fall from grace, and in doing so, underscore a rare form of political intelligence. By consistently fulfilling her ceremonial duties with quiet patience, she demonstrated to successive regimes that she posed no threat. This conduct, once dismissed as passive, is now celebrated as a subtle assertion of agency. In an age when women's voices were often silenced, Anne found a way to persist without needing to shout. Public interest in Anne of Cleves is no longer confined to specialist circles. Cultural commentators have begun to portray her not as a footnote in Henry VIII's marital chronicle, but as a figure whose life offers poignant insights into themes of survival and dignity. History podcasts gently muse over her life's what-ifs, inviting listeners to imagine alternative paths. What if she had resisted more strongly, or what if she had refused to accept the annulment? Yet even these speculations circle back to admiration for her choice to live on terms she could control, however limited. In popular media, Anne is shedding the label of the lucky one, who merely dodged the executioner's blade. Instead, filmmakers are crafting more nuanced portrayals. A woman of contemplative resolve rather than naive innocence. In one recent miniseries, the camera lingers on her thoughtful gaze as she reads a letter from her brother, conveying her inner life without the need for dramatic outbursts. Another novel recasts her story in epistolary form, using her correspondence to reveal the steady courage with which she faced exile and illness. These creative works aim to evoke empathy by presenting Anne as an individual with enduring vulnerability and strength, rather than as a political pawn. On stage, one act plays echo with her unspoken thoughts, delivered in soft monologues that capture the echo of her footsteps along castle corridors. Audiences find themselves leaning forward, imagining the weight of her two titles, Frederick of Cleves' daughter and Henry of England's briefly crowned wife, and the gulf between them. In these adaptations, Anne's silent resilience becomes the focal point. Rather than dramatizing her annulment with sword fights or prison escapes, they draw attention to her solitary moments in the Chelsea garden at twilight, her fingers brushing against lavender blooms in quiet defiance of despair. Art exhibits have also begun to incorporate Anne's legacy. Portraits of her by Hans Holbein, once appreciated merely for their artistic merit, are now accompanied by panels telling her life story, emphasizing how the painted image contrasts with the real woman's reserved nature. Visitors to gallery rooms stop to read captions detailing how the portrait, though masterful, was a piece of political art rather than an authentic likeness. Curators explain how Anne's true likeness was revealed in her compassionate gestures and uncomplaining patience, rather than in the regal posture of the painting. Social media feeds, too, reflect a growing fascination with her hidden narrative. Bloggers write quietly contemplative posts about the lessons of humility and endurance gleaned from Anne's story. Hashtags like Silent Queen and Anne of Cleves' resilience appear beneath digital illustrations depicting her in a simple kerchief rather than a bejeweled crown. These online tributes celebrate the notion that true power can lie in the choice to survive adversity without becoming a scandal's victim. The shift in perception extends to educational materials. Where once textbooks glossed over her reign with a single sentence, new editions allocate entire paragraphs to her personal journey. They describe the courage it took to accept her fate, the wisdom in forging an identity beyond the trappings of royalty, and the kindness she extended to those around her in her final days. Teachers use her life as a case study in perseverance, prompting students to discuss how Anne's strategies might apply to challenges they face today. In public memory, Anne of Cleves' narrative now stands as a quiet challenge to the idea that only grand feats define greatness. She invites us to consider the strength it takes to proceed softly in a world demanding noise. The horrific element of her experience, scholars remind us, was not a violent death but the cruel erasure of her presence, the slow fading of her name until only a plain tombstone remained. Yet it is precisely through that fading that her story gains resonance. It is a story not of dramatic martyrdom, but of the resilience that emerges in the whisper of a life lived on one's own terms. Ultimately, the simple slab marking Anne's grave speaks to a universal truth. Our worth is not measured only by the monuments that bear our names, but by the quiet legacies of compassion, dignity, and endurance we leave behind. As visitors pass by her unassuming tomb, they carry with them a deeper appreciation for a woman who chose the subtle art of survival over the allure of power, and in doing so, offers us all a gentle model of what it means to endure. The greatest legacy that Anne of Cleves bequeathed to the world was not her castles or estates, but a lesson in inner strength. In a realm that prized ostentation, she demonstrated that true power can lie in quiet endurance. It is not the victor of battles who necessarily commands the deepest respect, but the one who survives when the world turns away. Anne did not need to stage grand protests or public declarations. She simply chose to preserve her life, uphold her dignity, and extend compassion even when the currents of history threatened to sweep her away. Today, scholars are calling for Anne of Cleves to receive her due recognition in textbooks and palace exhibitions alike. They argue that our collective memory often overlooks those silent heroes, whose achievements are not measured by martial prowess or flamboyant deeds, but by the steadfast courage with which they navigate adversity. Anne stands as an emblem for anyone who faces immense pressure and refuses to yield, those who maintain integrity and kindness in the face of relentless challenge. By studying her life, students and museum visitors can appreciate a form of heroism defined not by conquest, but by the resilience to endure. Anne's story reminds us that the splendor of palace halls and the allure of a crown are not the ultimate measures of worth. Rather, it is how one confronts loneliness, suffering, and the cruelty of fate. She entered England as a political pawn, briefly a queen, and emerged as a survivor whose silent strength outlasted even the most violent of tragedies. In a court where every slip could result in the fall of a head, Anne chose discretion over defiance, humility over hubris. Through this choice, she secured a place in memory, albeit subtle rather than in scandal. In modern palace exhibitions, curators are beginning to acknowledge Anne's unique position. Portraits of her are now displayed alongside narratives that emphasize her resilience. Visitors read captions that frame her not merely as a diplomatic failure, but as a woman whose quiet perseverance offers lessons for our own turbulent times. Interactive exhibits ask viewers to reflect on the hardships Anne endured, the loss of home, the sting of public mockery, and the ache of isolation, and to consider how they might draw strength from her example in their personal lives. Textbook authors, too, are revising chapters on Tudor England to include more thoughtful accounts of Anne's tenure. They move beyond simple graphs of Henry's marital history and delve into Anne's own voice. The prayers she wrote in her German Psalter, the gentle gifts she bestowed on her servants, and the charity she extended to villagers at her death. In doing so, they paint a fuller picture of a woman whose presence, though sometimes overshadowed, was never entirely erased. This shift in perspective is mirrored in popular culture. Theatres are staging new adaptations of Anne's life, not as costume dramas steeped in court intrigue, but as intimate portraits of solitary strength. Audiences witness scenes of her in Chelsea Manor, tending her garden at dawn or reading letters by candlelight, each moment capturing the quiet dignity she maintained. These productions are lauded for bringing to the forefront the emotional nuances of an oft-forgotten queen. On screen, documentary filmmakers are crafting contemplative pieces that juxtapose the grandeur of Holbein's portrait with the simplicity of Anne's everyday rituals. Gentle music underscores footage of the very gardens she once walked, while voiceovers of her own recorded words evoke the rhythm of her prayers and reflections. Viewers find themselves lulled into empathy by the soft cadence, recognizing in Anne's experience the universal need for compassion and resilience. Social media influencers and history bloggers have also joined the chorus, posting whispered tales of Anne's survival against the hush of background music. Hashtags like Silent Strength and Remember Anne of Cleves accompany digital illustrations of Anne in modest attire rather than opulent robes. These online tributes invite followers to share their own stories of perseverance, ordinary victories over trials no less worthy than the epic sagas of kings and generals. In the realm of education, some teachers have introduced assignments that ask students to write letters from Anne's perspective, describing her hopes as she tended her Chelsea garden or dictating her final will. Such exercises foster empathy and encourage young minds to consider what it means to demonstrate courage without weapons or grand speeches. Through these classroom activities, Anne's example becomes a tool for personal growth rather than mere historical curiosity. Even within her own ancestral region of Cleves, local historians and civic groups are organizing commemorations. Plaques are being placed in the town square, recognizing the Duchess who once left home at 16 and never returned. Small gatherings of residents read aloud passages from Anne's letters, acknowledging the duality of her fate. A family princess thrust into foreign courts, yet ultimately choosing quiet dignity over dramatic reprisal. As we reflect on Anne's life, we see that her horrific ordeal was not marked by the clang of swords or the roar of public executions, but by the slow erosion of relevance and the sting of solitude. Her suffering was profound precisely because it unfolded in silence, unheard by the masses who later praised her for having got away. True horror lay in being forgotten, in having a fierce identity reduced to a footnote, and yet, through the gentle humility of her later years, Anne resisted that erasure. By continuing to live with empathy and composure, she carved out a quiet place in history. In this world of noise and spectacle, Anne's legacy whispers a counterpoint. That survival, carried out without fanfare, can be the most profound form of victory. She did not reclaim a throne, but she claimed her right to a life unbound by the caprices of others. She did not engage in furious rebellion, but she rebelled against despair with steadfast resolve. Her strength was neither loud nor flamboyant, but enduring in its simplicity. Ultimately, Anne of Cleves teaches us that we need not be warriors or rulers to be strong. Sometimes, the greatest triumph is to continue breathing, thinking, and feeling, even when all else seems lost. Her life urges us to value resilience, to honor the silent battles waged by countless individuals whose stories rarely make headlines. It reminds us that true dignity resides not in wielding power over others, but in mastering our own fear, preserving our humanity, and extending kindness, even in the face of abandonment. And so, as we close this tale of a queen who lived in the whisper of candlelight and the soft rustle of gardens, let us remember that our measure of worth is found not only in the heights we conquer, but in the depth of spirit with which we persist. Anne of Cleves, with her silent strength, calls us to recognize the quiet heroism within each of us, heroism that can endure long after the echoes of grandeur have faded into dusk. After the death of Henry VIII in 1547, Anne of Cleves harbored a quiet hope for renewed purpose under the reign of his son Edward VI. The young king, guided by Protestant reformers, might have looked kindly upon a fellow believer. In her mind, Anne imagined a place in this new religious household, perhaps a role in charitable works, or the chance to advise on alliances with German principalities. Yet the reality proved far different. The ministers of Edward's government viewed her as little more than the relic of a failed marriage, a cautionary tale rather than a valued counsellor. Invitations to state functions were rare and perfunctory. She received her annual pension with no acknowledgement beyond the clerk's signature, and her estates remained under the watchful administration of Crown appointees. As the years passed, Anne found no meaningful projects in which to engage. She was neither consulted on diplomatic dispatches, nor invited to serve on committees for relief of the poor or the Reformed Church. Her title of King's beloved sister lay dormant on official documents, but it carried no influence in Edward's court. Courtly circles continued their fervour over doctrinal disputes, scriptural translations, and the dissolution of monastic lands, while Anne lingered at the margins, a foreign princess whose single claim to fame was the brevity of her queenship. In Edward's reign, she was a silent shadow, her presence noted but her voice unheard. When Edward died in 1553, Anne dared to imagine a different path under Mary I. Mary, as a Catholic sovereign, might have seen in Anne a link to a shared royal lineage, especially given Anne's respectful treatment of Mary during her years of tribulation under her father's Protestant reforms. In those dark days when Mary had been confined in the Tower and relegated to the fringes of power, Anne had offered gentle words of solace and the occasional gift of fresh fruit from her gardens. These small gestures had created a bond of trust, and so Anne felt, perhaps naively, that Mary's accession would bring a restoration of goodwill. Alas, Mary's court was determined to re-establish traditional Catholic orthodoxy with zeal. Anne's well-known Protestant background became a mark against her. While Mary continued to address her as sister, the term felt more formal than affectionate. The new Catholic advisers refused to entrust her with any significant charitable projects, fearing that she might promote Protestant causes under the cover of philanthropy. They limited her participation in official ceremonies to mere presence, never allowing her to stand in a place of honour. Royal commemorations and church dedications went on without her active involvement. Instead, she remained at Chelsea Manor, her life once again confined to polite invisibility. Despite the political constraints, Anne maintained a daily practice of morning prayer, beginning each day with a reading from her German Psalter. She knelt by a small wooden altar in her private chapel, eyes closed, voice low, reciting hymns that had soothed her since childhood. The act of prayer provided both comfort and continuity as regimes shifted around her. She clung to the familiar rhythms of her faith, trusting that constancy and devotion could outlast any earthly throne. Letters from her brother in Cleves arrived at irregular intervals, each one a connection to the world she had left behind so many years earlier. His handwriting twirled across the page, recounting the changing seasons by the Rhine, the progress of his children in their studies, and occasional rumours of French intrigues. Anne treasured these correspondences, reading them by candlelight in the evenings and responding in halting French or simple German. Each letter brought fresh memories of home apple orchards, market days, and the laughter of her sisters. In those moments, she felt herself briefly transported across the sea to a place where she had been cherished for who she was, rather than for the political weight her marriage carried. Occasionally, Anne attended national ceremonies, such as Mary's coronation in October 1553. She dressed herself in silks of deep burgundy and ivory, wearing a modest crown of gilded metal rather than the jewelled diadem of her brief queenship. At Westminster Abbey, she stood among court ladies, her posture dignified yet withdrawn. The choir sang Latin masses, the air thick with incense, and Anne admired the solemn grandeur, even as she sensed the presence of distrust among the Catholic prelates. She did not join in the toasts or processions that followed, remaining content to observe from the shadows of the nave, her gaze drifting over the flicker of candles on the high altar. These ceremonial appearances were few and far between, and between them lay long stretches of solitude. Anne's days became a tapestry of simple routines: a leisurely morning stroll through her gardens when her health allowed, a meal of bread and cheese in her private sitting room, and the comforting hum of her ladies' soft voices as they went about their tasks. She listened to the dripping of water in her kitchen's well, and the distant tolling of church bells across the Thames, each sound a note in the symphony of a life lived in waiting. In these years of quiet exile, Anne of Cleves witnessed the ebb and flow of Tudor power, yet she remained untouched by the intrigues that consumed the noble houses. While younger and more ambitious courtiers schemed for influence, she withdrew to a life marked by reflection rather than ambition. Her identity, once wrapped in the silks and velvets of queenship, was now defined by the serenity of her acceptance. She cultivated patience, a rare commodity in a court famed for its sudden shifts of fortune. As the days slipped into months and the months into years, Anne's mind often wandered back to her family in Cleves. She remembered long summer evenings spent reading by the hearth with her sisters, the soft glow of lanterns in the courtyard, and the distant murmur of the Rhine's waters. These recollections sustained her through the chill of English winters, when the winds off the channel seeped through the manor's walls. She found solace in small acts of remembrance, a pressed flower tucked into her prayer book, or a familiar recipe sent in a letter from home. Thus, Anne of Cleves lived out her final chapter, no longer a player in the grand theatre of Tudor politics, but a quiet witness to history's march. She held on to her faith, her family ties, and her garden's gentle refuge. Though the world around her changed with startling rapidity, she maintained a steadfast heart, finding meaning in prayer, in correspondence, and in the occasional flicker of ceremony. In these simple routines lay her silent triumph, not in reclaiming power, but in preserving her spirit. Anne of Cleves's life, under Edward VI and Mary I, is a narrative of patience and quiet resilience. While others grasped at crowns and courted danger, she chose instead the path of least resistance, walking it with dignity and calm resolve. In doing so, she forged a legacy that transcends the fleeting glory of any throne, a legacy of endurance, humble grace, and the profound strength of silence. By the late 1550s, Anne of Cleves felt her strength slowly ebbing away. Tudor records note a persistent dry cough that seemed to rattle her ribs with each breath, a deep ache in her chest that refused to subside, and a steady weight loss that left her frail and hollow-cheeked. These symptoms, so classic of consumption, what some feared was tuberculosis, and what others whispered might be a malignancy of the lung, proved relentless. 16th-century medicine offered little more than herbal remedies, poultices of comfrey and mullein pressed against her sides, inhalations of thyme and rosemary vapours, and the occasional bloodletting by pale-faced barber surgeons. Mustard plasters were bound to her chest to draw out poisons, while apothecaries mixed bitter waters of gentian root and wormwood to ease her cough. Each treatment offered fleeting relief, and after each visit from the physicians, Anne would return to her chamber, breath shallow, spirit undimmed by the pain. She withdrew ever more completely to a private suite at Chelsea Manor, where the corridors were hushed and the walls hung with tapestries that had faded to mute tones over the years. Only her most trusted servants remained at her side. A chambermaid whose gentle touch soothed Anne's trembling hands, a cook who prepared barley broths and soft breads to coax nourishment into her failing body, and a lone companion who read aloud from her German psalter by candlelight each evening. These few faces formed the circle of her world, and through the small latticed windows she greeted them with a tired smile and a respectful nod. Beyond those windows lay the gardens she once tended, now too difficult to traverse more than a few paces at a time. Anne's daily life settled into a quiet rhythm. Each morning she knelt beside her bed and offered thanks for another day, murmuring prayers in the old tongue of her homeland. She read passages from the scriptures, underlining verses about endurance, hope, and divine mercy. At times, she wrote in a small diary, the edges of the pages worn by countless turns. In neat, careful script, she recorded memories of her family in Cleves, her brother's laughter as he played by the Rhine, the soft voice of her mother guiding her in prayer, the warmth of shared meals under candlelight. She noted her gratitude for the servants who remained loyal, listing each by name and offering thanks for their kindness amid her solitude. As spring turned to summer in 1557, Anne felt the urgency of her final tasks. In June of that year, she summoned her steward, a man of grey hair who had managed her estate since the annulment. By the light of a single tallow candle, she dictated her will in low, measured tones. She bequeathed small sums to each faithful attendant, a gold coin to the chambermaid who had cleaned her gowns with gentle care, a length of fine cloth to the cook whose broths had sustained her, and a modest pouch of silver to the companion who had read scripture by her bedside. These gifts were not grand enough to change their fortunes, but they carried the weight of sincere gratitude. Anne made specific mention of the years of service rendered in quiet ministering, how a soft word, a warm bowl of broth, or a helping hand on a bad day had meant far more than any jewel. Beyond her household, Anne remembered those less fortunate. She instructed that alms be distributed to the poor of Lewisham, Sodgewich, and Lambeth, loaves of bread baked to last, cloth to mend tattered garments, and coins to buy simple comforts. In her mind, these acts of charity echoed the kindnesses she herself had received when newly arrived in England, lost and fearful in a strange court. Her will made no mention of dukes, earls, or court favourites, only those who remained at her side in the silence, unseen by history's great chroniclers. Once the will was complete, Anne rested. Her breathing grew shallow, each inhale a quiet victory over the ache in her lungs. She closed her eyes, recalling for a moment the laughter of her childhood summers, days of sunshine and song, free from the weight of titles and alliances. Then she leaned back on her pillow, gaze drifting to a small herbarium pressed between wooden boards, where she had preserved sprigs of lavender and rosemary gathered from her garden. These faded blossoms, fragile in their dried state, symbolized for her the enduring beauty of memory amid decay. In the days that followed, Anne's condition worsened. The cough returned with renewed vigor, and the chest pains flared like embers in a dying hearth. She summoned her chambermaid and companion to her side, offering soft words of thanks for their care. She apologized for the burdens her illness had placed upon them, though they reassured her with gentle smiles and whispered assurances of loyalty. In her final hours, she asked to be taken back to her prayer bench. There, she recited the Lord's Prayer one last time in a trembling voice, her lips moving with deliberate calm. When at last she spoke her final syllable, the candle flickered, and the quiet of Chelsea Old Manor descended once more. Anne of Cleves, aged 41 years, drew her last breath. No trumpet sounded, no great bell tolled. Only the soft sigh of a passing breeze seemed to echo through the chamber, carrying with it the memory of a life lived in both splendour and solitude. Her servants washed her body with reverence, laid her in a simple linen shroud, and placed the German psalter and her small diary beside her. They bound her hands across her chest, the rosary she had worn now clasped between her fingers. Her chamber, once silent but for the measured breaths of the sick, now held a different hush. The hush of completion, the hush of a story at its end. In keeping with her wishes, Anne's funeral was modest. Her coffin was carried from Chelsea to Westminster Abbey on a quiet carriage, drawn by 2 gentle horses. No state procession accompanied her. Only the few who had shared her last days walked beside her, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. At the abbey, the service was held in the lesser aisle, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone. The prayers were soft, the choir's voices low, and the assembled few, cloaked in simple black, offered final blessings before the coffin was lowered into the resting niche. And so, with silence and simplicity, ended the earthly chapter of Anne of Cleves. Her life had spanned the zenith of Tudor power and the gentle decline into quiet dignity. In her final retreat to Chelsea Old Manor, in her whispered prayers and handwritten remembrances, she left behind a legacy not of military triumph or political conquest, but of grace under fire, compassion in adversity, and the enduring strength found in silent perseverance. On the 16th of July, 1557, Anne of Cleves drew her final breath at Chelsea Old Manor, departing this world in the same gentle hush that had characterized her brief reign and long years in exile. At 41 years old, she passed away quietly, without fanfare or fanfare's attendant crowds. News of her death lingered in the corridors of power as a soft echo rather than a clarion call. The arrangements for her funeral reflected the simplicity of her final days. There would be no state funeral draped in black velvet, no weeks of official mourning decreed by royal proclamation. Instead, a modest gathering of court officials, and the few attendants who had served her, remained to pay their respects. Her body was placed in a plain wooden coffin, the grain of the oak faintly visible beneath a simple shroud. Gentle hands those of her loyal chambermaid, and a single chaplain gathered around to offer prayers as the coffin was carried along the narrow, dimly lit corridors of Chelsea Old Manor. Each step echoed softly against stone floors worn smooth by the passage of many feet over countless generations. Even the torchlight seemed subdued, as though it too recognized the solemn dignity of the moment. The procession moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the hush of the manor, a whispered reminder of a life lived in restraint and repose. From Chelsea, Anne's coffin was conveyed to Westminster Abbey. The carriage, unadorned and discreet, rolled along streets lined with onlookers who murmured prayers in respect for a woman who had once been a queen, yet lived most of her life at a distance from power. Officials wearing plain robes walked alongside, their footsteps measured, their faces grave. There was no ceremonial guard of honor, no grand display of heralds or trumpeters, only the quiet urgency of wagons crossing cobbled lanes at dusk. Inside the venerable walls of the abbey, the service was held in the chapels adjoining the main sanctuary. Candles flickered in sconces, casting gentle shadows on ancient stone, and the air smelled of incense and old wood. A handful of courtiers, those who had known Anne in her fleeting tenure as queen, and those few who remained true in her widowhood, stood in respectful silence. The chaplain intoned psalms in a soft voice, his words drifting like mist through the vaulted aisles. There was no lengthy sermon on statecraft or lineage. Instead, the focus rested on Anne's Christian virtues, her charity to the poor, her gentleness to her servants, and her steadfast faith in adversity. When the service concluded, the coffin was brought to the south ambulatory, a secluded passage seldom trodden by the main crowds who came to venerate kings and saints. There, in a simple niche carved into the cool stone wall, Anne's coffin was lowered into the earth. No effigy crowned the tomb, no bas-relief depicted her likeness. Only a plain slab of pale marble was placed above the grave, bearing the inscription, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England, 1540 to 1557. The dates alone marked her passage through history, an unembellished testament to the span of her life. Visitors in later centuries who wander the abbey's less travelled corridors may hardly notice the unassuming tomb. Their footsteps echo past grand monuments to monarchs and martyrs, their eyes drawn to ornate sculptures, gilded sarcophagi, and vaulted chapels. Few pause beneath the archway where Anne lies. Few realize that under their feet rests a woman whose story weaves through the grand tapestry of Tudor drama. Yet it is precisely this humility that magnifies her message. She needed no grandeur in death, just as she had lived with quiet dignity in life. In the hush of the south ambulatory, one can almost hear the whisper of her final years, the prayerful moments at dawn, the soft rustle of her simple gowns, the gentle crackle of hearth fires in Chelsea Manor. The unadorned stone of her tomb stands as a silent lecture on the nature of true esteem. It is not measured in opulent memorials or ostentatious verse, but in the unspoken impact of a life lived with compassion, resilience, and unwavering faith. As modern pilgrims to Westminster Abbey pass through this corridor, some are drawn by curiosity rather than devotion. They step off the beaten path and find themselves before Anne's modest memorial. In that quiet space, they might reflect on the impermanence of power and the endurance of character. Here lies a queen who reigned for only 6 months yet endured for decades, a duchess whose voice was seldom heard in the clamour of court, yet whose presence left a gentle echo in the hearts of those she served. The simplicity of Anne's burial site has inspired scholars and lay visitors alike to ponder the contrasts of her life, the fleeting splendour of princesshood and queenship, and the enduring strength of a woman determined to survive. Her unpretentious tomb invites a different kind of pilgrimage, one not to witness regal opulence, but to seek the quiet wisdom that emerges when one faces hardship with grace. In the soft glow of the ambulatory lamps, her story resonates like a whispered secret, that nobility lies not in the weight of a crown, but in the capacity to endure beneath its shadow. And so, in that serene corner of Westminster Abbey, Anne of Cleves rests on. Her memory, like her life, endures not through spectacle, but through the lessons she quietly bestowed. That true strength often dwells in silence, that dignity can outlast adversity, and that the most profound legacies may be written not on triumphant banners, but on stones unadorned. In the hush of her tomb, one hears the echo of her gentle triumph, a lasting reminder that a life lived with courage and compassion can speak volumes, even when the voice is but a whisper. In recent decades, the story of Anne of Cleves has enjoyed a remarkable renaissance in both academic and cultural circles. No longer is she dismissed merely as the lucky wife who escaped the axe. Instead, historians celebrate her as an exemplar of survival under the most unrelenting political pressure. They emphasize how her blend of patience, wisdom, and compassion enabled her to preserve not only her life, but also her dignity and a measure of freedom within an autocratic regime. Scholarly monographs now explore Anne's inner life, reconstructing her experience with meticulous attention to context. Researchers have pored over letters, estate records, and household inventories to piece together the texture of her daily existence. Her moments of prayer in the early dawn, her walks among Chelsea's clipped box hedges, her carefully composed notes of thanks to servants and correspondents. These studies emphasize her strategic acumen. By consenting to the annulment of her marriage, she avoided a far worse fate and secured the means to live with relative comfort. They highlight how she navigated the volatile waters of Tudor court politics, never openly defying authority yet maintaining her religious convictions in the face of successive, often hostile regimes. Museum exhibitions have likewise devoted entire galleries to Anne's life story. Curators juxtapose her portrait, painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, with objects that speak to her fortitude. A fragment of her German Psalter, pressed flowers from her Chelsea garden, and an original page from her final will. Audio installations allow visitors to listen to readings of her prayers and letters, rendered in a soft, contemplative tone that underscores the depth of her faith and resilience. Rather than presenting her as a passive figure at the mercy of events, these exhibitions frame her as an active agent whose choices, though subtle, shaped her destiny. Documentaries have followed suit, weaving Anne's narrative into broader explorations of Tudor power. Narrators speak in hushed voices, reflecting the subdued tenor of Anne's own life. They recount how her yes to annulment was far from a simple concession. It was a calculated move to ensure her safety. They explore her quiet acts of charity, her donations to the poor of Lewisham and Lambeth, gifts so modest yet so deeply felt by her beneficiaries. Through interviews with historians and dramatic reenactments, these films paint Anne as a woman of inner strength rather than a mere footnote in Henry VIII's matrimonial saga. Academic conferences frequently feature panels on Anne's legacy. Scholars present papers on everything from the symbolism of her Holbein portrait, its serene pose, masking a shrewd political tool, to the botanical significance of her Chelsea garden, where she cultivated remedies and tokens of home. Each presentation peels back another layer of her experience, revealing the dimensions of her character. Her ability to balance humility with self-preservation, her deft handling of religious convictions under alternating Protestant and Catholic monarchs, and her enduring empathy for those who served her. In popular culture, authors are revisiting Anne's story with fresh empathy. Historical novels now center her perspective, giving voice to her internal monologue as she negotiates her precarious position. These narratives avoid sensationalism, instead capturing the quiet moments that defined her. The hush of midnight vigils, the rustle of silk against the cold stone of castle walls, the weight of a single rose petal in her hand. Readers respond to this intimacy, remarking on how Anne's trials mirror modern challenges of maintaining personal integrity in hostile environments. Students of leadership and resilience have also taken interest in her example. Business schools cite Anne's strategic acquiescence as a case study in crisis management. She identified the parameters of her survival, communicated with key stakeholders, including Henry himself, and secured the best possible outcome under dire circumstances. Leadership seminars highlight her emphasis on relationship building, her generosity to her household staff and to local poor as a lesson in the power of empathy to sustain morale and create lasting bonds. Even social media influencers have turned to Anne as a touchstone for quiet strength. On platforms designed for rapid attention-grabbing content, they post serene images of Holbein's calm countenance, alongside captions extolling the virtues of patience and humility. Hashtags like Quiet Queen and Anne of Cleves Rise appear under digital scrapbooks of her life, snippets of letters, photographs of her tomb, and illustrations of Chelsea's winding paths. Thousands of viewers like and repost these glimpses, drawn to the idea that true power can be gentle, that survival can be victory. In theatre, playwrights are crafting intimate one-woman shows in which Anne reflects on her journey. Under a single spotlight, an actress inhabits Anne's voice, weaving reflections on betrayal, faith, and fleeting joy. Audiences find themselves lulled by the steady rhythm of her monologues, its soft cadence, a mirror of Anne's composed demeanor. Rather than grandiose proclamations, the play's power lies in its simplicity. A solitary figure, a handful of props, a garden rose, a prayer book, and the audience's growing empathy for a woman who chose quiet endurance over dramatic revolt. Symposia exploring gender and power increasingly highlight Anne's life as a paradigm of feminine agency under constraint. Papers analyse how Anne's compliance with the annulment, so often miscast as weakness, was in fact a form of self-determination. They discuss her navigation of courtly expectations, balancing public obligations with private autonomy. They underscore how her tenacity created a space of dignity in which she could live on her own terms, despite having been thrust into the maelstrom of Tudor politics. As a result of this scholarly and cultural attention, plans are underway to refurbish and enhance her tomb in Westminster Abbey. Working with the Abbey's chapter, historians propose adding a simple plaque that recites her name and the dates in both English and German, acknowledging her dual heritage. They envision an unobtrusive information panel nearby, inviting visitors to discover her story and reflect on her quiet triumph. The aim is not to transform her resting place into a spectacle, but to ensure that her unadorned legacy resonates with modern pilgrims, seeking examples of steadfastness and grace. Through these varied efforts, academic, curatorial, literary, and digital Anne of Cleves is emerging from the shadows into a well-deserved prominence. Her life is no longer a mere afterthought to Henry VIII's marital adventures. It is a testament to the power of strategic humility, compassionate leadership, and spiritual fortitude. Her legacy challenges us to reconsider our definitions of strength and success. In an era that often equates impact with noise, Anne reminds us that the most profound influence can emerge in silence, in the decision to endure rather than to resist, to show kindness rather than to demand vengeance. Her story resonates across centuries because it speaks to a universal truth, that preserving one's humanity in the face of adversity is a victory in itself. Anne of Cleves, once eclipsed by more turbulent figures, now stands as a beacon for those who seek to navigate their own trials with quiet dignity. Her example endures not in the grand halls of power, but in the hearts of those who value resilience over spectacle and compassion over conquest. In the soft glow of history's rediscovery, Anne's silent strength shines more brightly than ever. As we draw tonight's journey through the life of Anne of Cleves to a close, you might find yourself reflecting on the unexpected contours of her story. What begins as the tale of a briefly crowned queen quickly unfolds into a study of quiet endurance, strategic humility, and compassionate leadership. Today's video has shown that true strength does not always roar from the mountaintop. Sometimes it whispers softly in the corridors of adversity. Anne's ability to survive political turmoil, preserve her dignity, and extend kindness even when surrounded by suspicion offers us a powerful lesson. Resilience is often forged in silence. By witnessing Anne's choices accepting an annulment that spared her life, cultivating deep empathy for those who served her, and maintaining her faith in shifting religious landscapes, we gain insight into the art of navigating modern pressures. Whether you find yourself facing workplace conflicts, personal setbacks, or the relentless pace of social media, there is value in pausing to ask, how might I respond with patience rather than pride? How can I preserve my integrity without sacrificing my well-being? Anne's example encourages us to prioritize our inner resources, self-respect, compassion, and adaptability over the fleeting applause of external approval. Tonight's video has underscored several key messages that resonate deeply in our 21st century lives. The power of strategic humility. Anne teaches us that conceding when necessary can be a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. In many professional or personal situations, choosing to step back or seek compromise can safeguard relationships and well-being, much as it did for Anne at the Tudor court. Endurance through compassion. Even in isolation, Anne turned her thoughts outward, caring for her servants and the poor. In our world, small acts of kindness, checking in on a friend, volunteering a bit of time, or offering a listening ear, can create ripples of positive change that outlast any single achievement. Maintaining inner dignity. Faced with mockery and misunderstanding, Anne never abandoned her composure. She reminds us that how we carry ourselves, our tone, our posture, our words, can influence how we are perceived and remembered more than any title or trophy ever could. Faith in one's convictions. Though pressured by alternating Protestant and Catholic regimes, Anne held to her core beliefs. In modern life, whether our convictions are spiritual, ethical, or creative, remaining true to them provides a compass when external winds blow strong. These principles are not relics of history. They are timeless guides for anyone seeking to thrive amid complexity. You may not find yourself negotiating royal alliances, but you do face choices about when to push forward and when to yield. how to treat those around you, and how to preserve self-respect through life's unexpected turns. Like Anne, you can learn that sometimes the most profound victories are measured not by dramatic conquest, but by the grace with which you endure. As we end tonight's exploration, ask yourself, which moments in your life call for a bit of Anne's silent strength? Where might a gesture of quiet compassion deepen your connections? And in what ways can you cultivate patience and humility as tools for lasting resilience? Thank you for joining this reflective voyage through Anne of Cleves' remarkable journey. If you're still awake, I wish you a peaceful night's rest. May your dreams be gentle and your spirit renewed by the lessons of the past. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you never miss our newest and most inspiring stories. Good night, and until next time, may you carry a touch of Anne's quiet courage into your own life.